Good day everyone, I am Kazal Jane Ambaliwan. Together with my group mates, we will going to discuss about the psychological foundation of curriculum. Let's discover about the psychological foundation of curriculum. When we say psychological, it provides a basis to understand the teaching and learning process. It unifies elements of the learning process. Psychological foundation is based on the individual differences. Every student has its own unique personality and they have differences in their learning and skills. They are different in nature so they can't be treated alike in teaching and learning process. There are three major theories such as behaviorism. It focuses on stimulant responses and reinforces. Studies conditioning, modifying, or shaping behavior through reinforcement and rewards. For example, when teachers reward their class or certain student with a party or special treat at the end of the week for good behavior throughout the week. The same concept is used with punishments. The teacher can take away certain privileges if the student misbehaves. Second is cognitive. It focuses on the information processing in relation to the total environment. Studies developmental stages, understanding, multiple forms of intelligence, problem solving, critical thinking, and creativity. Cognitive learning is a style of learning that encourages students to use their brains more effectively. This way of learning encourages students to fully engage in the learning process, so learning, thinking, and remembering get easier and easier. And the last one is humanistic. It focuses on the whole child, their social, psychological, and cognitive development. Studies focus on human need, attitudes, feelings, and self-awareness. Humanistic harnesses the idea that if students are upset, sad, or distressed, they're less likely to be able to focus on learning. This encourages teachers to create a classroom environment that helps students feel comfortable and safe so they can focus on their learning.
Hello, good day. I'm Jorlina. I will discuss Ivan Pavlov and let's together find out how Ivan Pavlov contribute to psychological foundations curriculum. Ivan Pavlov, he developed a theory called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlov's dog experiment played a critical role in the discovery of one of the most important concepts in psychology, which is classical conditioning. So as you can see at the picture, that is Ivan Pavlov, the person who discovers classical conditioning, which surprisingly, he is not a psychologist but he is a physiologist. Pavlov's famous experiment had a significant impact on our understanding of how learning occurs as well as the development of the school of behavioral psychology, despite the fact that they occurred entirely by chance. So Pavlovian conditioning is a term that is used to describe classical conditioning. So what is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is a type of learning that had a major influence in the school of thought in psychology known as behaviorism. It's important to note that classical conditioning involves placing a neutral signal before a naturally occurring reflex. So this classical condition is a big help to John B. Watson as he used the discovery of Pavlov to develop the school of thought, which is behaviorism. So when we say behaviorism, again, this is predicted on the assumption that learning occurs through interaction with one's surrounding. So Pavlov taught us that learning principle apply across species in that classical conditioning is one method by which nearly all organisms learn to adapt to their environment. So classical conditioning is the act of conditioning someone to behave in the behavior that we want them to portray or to act. It is the association between environmental stimuli and the organism's response. So before we dig deeper to the discovery of Pavlovian, let us first know the terms that he's used. First, terminology is stimulus. So a stimulus is something that causes a response. So stimulus simply defines as anything that can trigger a physical or behavioral change. In short, it is the things or event that will produce reaction. Next term that he used is unconditioned stimulus. A stimulus that you did not have to be thought to react to, you react by instinct. So it means unlearned. Ito yung mga bagay na nagdudulot ng kusa or natural reaction. For example, when you smell one of your favorite foods, ay makakaramdam ka kagad ng gutom. In this example, the smell of the food is the unconditioned stimulus. The next is unconditioned response, a response from a stimulus that you did not have to be trained to react to. So when we say response, it is the interpretation or the reaction. Ang unconditional response naman ay reflexive response, mean it happens automatically. In our example earlier, the feeling of hunger in response to the smell of food is the unconditioned response. Next, we have the neutral stimulus. So a stimulus that doesn't mean anything to you yet. It means it doesn't mean anything. So it does not yet produce an automatic response, so wala pa siyang sense. Then we have the conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that you have to be thought to react to. So, ang neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus when paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Ibig sabihin nito, kapag ang isang neutral stimulus, like for example, ang bell, mag-collab ng unconditioned stimulus, which is snack, for example, this bell plus snack will produce a learned response sa isang tao. Ang kaninang bell na walang meaning, ngayon may sense na that is what we call conditioned stimulus. Stimulus that become able to produce a learned reflex response. So after that, we have the conditioned response, a response to a stimulus that you had to be trained to react to. So dito, conditioned response naman, given the example kanina, kapag narinig na ng isang tao ang bell, alam na agad nila na snack time na. A learned reflex response to a conditioned stimulus. So now, let's find out how he discovers classical conditioning. So, Pavlov noticed an interesting occurrence while studying the digestions in dogs. His subject, canine, would begin to salivate whenever an assistant entered the room. So, si Pavlov and his assistants would introduce a variety of edible and non-edible items into his digestive research and measure the saliva production that the items produce. So, napansin niya that salivation is a reflexive response. So, it happens automatically in response to a specific stimulus and is uncontrollable. But later on, napansin niya na even in the absence of the food or even the smell, still nagasalivate pa rin ang aso. So, in the presence of his assistant, which the animals had come to associate with the presentation of food. Unlike the salivary response to the presentation of food, which is unconditioned reflex. So, salivating to the expectation of food is conditioned reflex. So, Pavlov investigated it and traced experiment to know the reason. So, ginamit niyang food as the unconditioned stimulus or the stimulus that evokes a response naturally and automatically. Then, ang sound of a metronome naman ang ginamit to be the neutral stimulus. So, the dog would first be exposed to the sound of the ticking metronome and the food was immediately presented. And he concluded that ang kaninang neutral stimulus, which is the metronome, ay naging conditioned stimulus then provoke a conditioned response which is the salivation.
So, in summary, the picture shows the Pavlovian conditioning. The sight or smell of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, causes the dog to salivate, which is the unconditioned response. Ordinarily, a neutral stimulus, such as a bell ring, does not cause the dog to salivate. There is no response to food, only to a sound where the dog may move its ears. We can, however, condition the dog to respond to the tone. Simply ring the bell and immediately follow it with food. Eventually, the dog will salivate, which is the conditioned response, at the sound of the bell alone, which is the conditioned stimulus. The dog has associated the tone with food and has been conditioned.
Good day everyone, this is Kent Ian Silverio and I am with Miss Crizel Ann Arancilio and we are the second reporter for the topic Psychological Foundation of the Curriculum, and we are going to discuss to you the contribution of Edward Thorndike in this topic. So who is Edward Thorndike? Edward Thorndike was a famous psychologist who was born during 1898 or in that specific year. I don't know what the exact date or month is. And he is also famous for his learning theory, or what we call the Thorndike theory, that consists of 3 laws: the law of exercise, the law of effect, and the law of readiness. And those laws enables, of course, the teacher to teach their learners to be more efficient and effective students. Right now, I'm going to discuss to you the first law among the 3 laws that Edward Thorndike was proposed. And this law is the law of exercise. Connection between stimulus and response will be strengthened by practice. So things in here are more often repeated to have a best result. Of course, when a learners, for example, get through a lot of repeated trials or continually reading their lesson, probably that learners could get a high grades. And if someone who is discontinued in reading at some point, probably that learners could get a lower grade versus the student who continually reading. That's why the teacher should give or provide different opportunities for learners to practice or repeat the task, such that recalling or reviewing the discussion or even the task that you have given to the student. Also, teachers should have constant practice in what has been learned in the classroom, because delayed use or long disuse or discontinued practice may cause forgetfulness of the students. And I think that's the end of my discussion, and I will give the floor to Miss Crisel Ann Arancilio.
As Mr. Salverio already discussed to us the first law of learning according to Thorndike, which is the law of exercise, at this point we will going to discuss the second law of learning, which is the law of effect. So what is this law of effect? So the law of effect in this law states that the emotional state of the learner affect the learning. So in this, the learning process can be strengthened or weakened. Basically, it will be strengthened when it is accompanied by pleasant or satisfying feeling. And otherwise, it can be weakened when it is associated with an unpleasant feeling. So, if we were going to put it in education, for instance, the failure of a student accompanied by the discouraging emotional state should be avoided, because it may be the reason that the students will lose their interest to their study or their interest to go to school. And also, the law of effect give emphasis and giving punishment or reward to the students. So, giving punishment should be avoided as far as possible, because it may produce negative effect and can cause discouragement to the students. While giving reward and recognition naman will play a great role to encourage the students. So, for example, the teacher who motivating and give reward to his or her student to do his or her homework, then the students will become happy or willing to do his or her homework. But if the teacher always give a punishment to a student, then the probability will be the students will become lazy to do his or her homework. So, we can see here the connection of stimulus and response, which can be a product of an effect. So, that's the law of effect according to Thorndike. Next is the third law of learning, which is the law of readiness. So, this law of readiness, it's all about the degree of preparedness and eagerness to learn. So, in this law, the learner must be ready and in good condition in order to be success in his or her learning. So, readiness, sir, must be in psychologically and physically. So, as a learner, you must be ready in your physique, which means you are not in sick condition, and you are ready psychologically, which means as a learner, you do not have a mental sickness and other that may be burden on your learnings. Also, individuals learn best when they are ready to learn, and they will not learn much if they see no reason for learning. So, its educational implication is that as a teacher or instructor, we should look for some techniques and how are we going to arouse the interest and desire of our students to learn. We should also arouse curiosity for learning so that the students will feel ready to imbibe the new experience on their learning process. So, for example, a student who is willing to participate or recite in class, then he or she will do that thing, like she will listen to someone who will speak, and if he or she does that, he or she will be satisfied and happy. So that's all about the law of learning according to Thorndike.
Hello, my dear classmate, and once again, good afternoon to each and everyone. So, this man flash on your screen is Robert M. Gagne, and he was an educational psychologist who pioneered the science of instruction in the 1940s. And he has a book which is entitled The Conditions of Learning, which is first published in the 1965, which identify the mental conditions that are necessary for effective learning. So here are the following contributions of Gagne in psychological foundation of curriculum. So first is he proposed the hierarchical learning theory, which he believes that learning follows a hierarchy. And also second, he believes that the behavior of an individual is based on a prerequisite conditions. And lastly, he introduced the tasking in the formulations of objectives. So in this discussion, we will be more learned about Gagne's contributions. And to start with, let us hear from Miss Ellen Diaz. Ellen?
Thank you, Raymond. So the topic assigned to us is all about Gagne's principles. Different instruction is required for different learning outcomes. Gagne identifies 5 major categories of learning. First, the verbal information. Second, the intellectual skills. Third, cognitive strategies. Fourth, attitude. And lastly is the motor skills. So the 5 categories of learning, the verbal information is declarative knowledge is seen when the learner is able to declare or state what he or she has learned. Second, the intellectual skills, formerly known as procedural skills, is the most clear-cut way to identify the learner's preparedness. They include concepts, rules, and procedures. It is entail understanding how to carry out an action. Third, the cognitive strategies. Gagne defines cognitive strategies as enabling learners to exercise some degree of control over the processes involved in attending, perceiving, encoding, remembering, and thinking. Fourth, the attitude are referred internal states that cannot be observed directly and sometimes described as having emotional and cognitive components. They influence behavior. So in verbal, in attitude, defined as an acquired internal state that influences the choice of personal action. Lastly is the motor skills. This learning involves seeing how the learner is able to carry out steps of a motor performance or procedure in proper order. It is the combining of both skills or hand-on tasks. An indication of performance are not a primary educational goal. So, having an understanding of Gagne's learning outcome can be useful in determining class content for bibliographical instruction course. Gagne's principle learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned in a sequence of instructions. Gagne suggests that learning tasks for intellectual skills can be organized in a hierarchy according to complexity. So learning hierarchy technique is a top-down analysis technique that can be used by an instructional designer for identify the prerequisites for an expected learning outcome in the intellectual learning domain. So there are 8 learning hierarchies. First, the stimulus recognition. Second, the response generation. Third, procedure following. Fourth, use of terminology. Fifth, discriminations. Sixth, concept formation. Seventh, rule application. And lastly, the problem solving. So thank you for listening.
Okay, so the third principle of Gagne is that events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute to the conditions of learning. So Gagne created a 9-step process which is also called the events of instruction. And the first one here is gaining attention or reception. It is to ensure that the learners are ready to learn and participate in activities by presenting a stimulus to gain their attention. And because of many distractions present upon entry to the classroom, as an educator, it is very important to capture our learners' attention immediately. And because I believe that learning may only take place when the students are focused, if you have managed as a teacher, if you have managed to pick their interest. Next here is informing learners of the objective or expectancy. Inform students of the objectives or outcomes to help them understand what they are to learn during the course, and provide objectives before instructions begin, because the learning objective is typically shared with students early the start of the lesson, and this is not only helps them to achieve the specific expectations related to the learning goal, but also internally motivates them to complete each task. Events of instruction is stimulating recall of prior learning or retrieval. It helps the students to make sense of new information by relating it to something they already know or something they have already experienced. So, because learning is a process of comprised of many steps where each new piece of information is built upon the last. So, prior experiences facilitate the learning process because they allow information to be stored meaningfully. The next event of instructions is presenting the stimulus. Use strategies to present and cue lesson content to provide more effective, efficient instruction. Organize and chunk content in a meaningful way. Provide explanations after demonstrations. So after drawing on a prior knowledge, the content of the lesson is then presented to each learner. And as a future educator, it is our responsibility that the information should be presented in a various ways in order to meet everyone's learning style. And next here is providing learning guidance or semantic encoding. So advise students of strategies to aid them in learning content and of the resources available. So the overarching goal of providing learning guidance is to make the stimulus as meaningful as possible, and making connections with the topic of study helps the learners better retain information. And this event also offers examples of correct performance in the form of graphs or case studies. And the next event of instruction is eliciting performance or responding. Activate students' processing to help them internalize new skills and knowledge and to confirm correct understanding of these concepts. So in this process, it is now the learner's turn to direct the next event by practicing the skill they learned. So the learner will demonstrate their understanding with a performance, which will further cement or widen their knowledge on the topic. And however, the role of the instructor is still valuable. The teacher can support memory retention and initiate learning by creating effective evaluations like tests and quizzes. Also, the teacher can provide midpoint assessment like projects, assignments, or presentations. And also directing classroom activities like encourage collaboration as thought-provoking questions. Seventh event of instruction is to provide feedback. Provide immediate feedback of the student's performance to assess and facilitate learning. And we all know that feedback is a valuable tool used to keep the students on track towards the learning goal. And personal and timely guidance from the instructor or from the teacher allows the students to modify their performance in order to meet the objective. And also feedback from their peers is also valuable, as it may help them to answer their questions during the learning process. Here is assess performance. So in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the instructional events, you must test to see if the expected learning outcomes have been achieved. Performance should be based on previously stated objectives. So assessing students' performance is usually demonstrated in the form of a summative assessments, whether the learner is able to meet the objectives without prompting or support. It is also important to note that one evaluation alone is not sufficient to determine if a student needs additional practice on some skills or whether the content has been stored in a memory. And also multiple evaluations may be necessary to determine if the learning goals have been truly achieved. So we are now down on the last event of instruction, which is enhanced retention and transfer to the job. In order to help the learners develop expertise, they must internalize new knowledge. And one way to support retention of skills is by practice. And practice is said to be proven to be effective in developing the application of skills, as well as increasing the likelihood that the skills will be retained over a long period of time. So that is the 9 events of Gagne. So before we end our discussion, we prepare here a simple activity which compose a one question that you need to answer. And to wrap up my report, Gagne offers a systematic learning theory that can be greatly beneficial to us teachers. And Gagne's 9 events serve as a structure or the outline to help us deliver our objectives while assessing the learning conditions in class. And also preparing the framework ahead of time allows us or each event to be placed in an appropriate place, as well as the content to be organized in a meaningful way. So I guess that's conclude our presentation, and I hope you learned something. Keep safe everyone. God bless.